Good afternoon. If everyone can find a seat, and if there are not enough spaces available here, we do have an overflow room. And if anyone is standing in the back and would like to have a little bit more of a comfortable space to sit down there, we'd invite you to do that. Thank you all for joining us today on Indigenous Peoples Day. My name is Youssef Munayer. I'm the director here at the Jerusalem Fund, and on behalf of our board of directors, I'm very happy to welcome you back for this Palestine Center event today. Just a couple of brief announcements before we get started. The event today is live streaming, and for those who are following online, you can participate in the question and answer session and in commentary about this event via Twitter. We're using the hashtag ESML, which is Edward Said Memorial Lecture 14. So you can send your questions in by tagging that hashtag, or of course sending them to @Palestine Center, which is our handle. For those of you in the room, if you could just take this moment to silence your phones or anything else that would disturb our presentation, we'd appreciate it. After today's event, we have a number of events coming up this fall, and I will just take a moment to highlight a couple. On Thursday, the 23rd of October, which is 10 days from today, we have a book talk by Richard Falk on The Legitimacy of Hope, which is the title of his new book. So we'd encourage you to check that out. We also have the opening of a art exhibit featuring early 20th century watercolors from Jerusalem on the 24th of October. Information on those events and many more are available on the information table outside and, of course, on the website. Moving to today's program, we're very happy to host on an annual basis a memorial lecture commemorating the contributions in life of Professor Edward Said, who we lost far too early as a guiding light and an intellectual, not just in the Palestinian cause, but also in studies on post-colonialism and critical theory and comparative literature and the like. This lecture is one of our key events annually, and we're very happy to have Dr. Judith Butler as our Edward Said Memorial Lecturer this year. Dr. Butler is the Maxine Elliott Professor in the Department of Rhetoric and Comparative Literature and the co-director of the program on critical theory at the University of California, Berkeley. She's the author of numerous books, and her most recent is Parting Ways, Jewishness and the Critique of Zionism. She also is active in gender and sexual politics and human rights, anti-war politics, and Jewish Voices for Peace. Today, she will discuss the differential value accorded to Palestinian and Israeli lives in light of the most recent Israeli military campaign on the Gaza Strip, in which massacres and violations of international law have occurred. So please join me in welcoming our Edward Said Memorial Lecturer today, Dr. Judith Butler.
Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be here. I want to thank Youssef and also his staff for making this possible for me. The title of my talk today is What is the Value of Palestinian Lives? I know that the Said Lecture is a way to honor and remember the extraordinary work of the scholar Edward Said, including his prodigious literary accomplishments and his incisive public and political commentary. And so the question of how best to honor him has to be thought through, since my task today, after the Gaza massacres, after the most recent and most devastating Gaza massacres, is to try to think about him, but also with him, his words, the words he left us, even though he was writing in a different political time. So I do not want so much to return to his work, but to bring that work forward in in order to think with and through his words about how it is that a certain question can emerge during this time. What is the value of Palestinian lives? To ask the question is already rather terrible. Why does such a question have to be asked at all? And when we ask it, are we also asking for whom Palestinian lives have value? Could it be that the answer to the question is no, they do not have value? The question should not surprise us if we consider the political situation in which Palestinian lives are considered expendable, when we recognize that the international outcry against the latest bombardment of Gaza, for instance, was muffled, if not censored, and when we recognize that what I should call these crimes are very far from being recognized or adjudicated in existing international courts. So on the one hand, we should not be surprised that the value of Palestinian lives has once more come into question. On the other hand, we should always be surprised, for without that sense of shock, even bewilderment, without a sense of being scandalized, we will lose the fully appropriate rage and the fully appropriate grief that is a crucial part of political resistance. So one asks the question, what is the value of Palestinian lives, to show that there is no consensus on the matter and to expose this as a moral and political scandal. To ask the question is to show the horror of the question. Indeed, one asks the question simply, unbelievably, to show that the question can be asked and that this should not be the case. Of course, it's possible to respond quickly and set the matter aside. Of course, Palestinian lives, like all lives, have value and ought to have value and ought not to be threatened, humiliated, terrorized, or destroyed. Such an answer seeks recourse to what I would call a quick universalism, one that works simply by asserting the abstract equality of all lives, regardless of where they are from, regardless of ethnicity, religion, regional location, race, gender, and all the other possible social determinations of human life. Indeed, it's possible to accept that abstract equality of all lives and yet to live and act in a world that does not reflect that equality in concrete terms. This produces a certain schism in the mind. One defends the equal value of all lives as human lives, abstracting them, yes, from their social and political location. At the same time, precisely because one clings to the abstraction in the place of social reality, one accepts the differential way that lives are valued in the social, economic, and political sphere. In that way, the abstract equality that is asserted among all lives functions as an alibi for not recognizing and opposing concrete and urgent inequalities. Although I've just suggested that a quick version of universal equality can serve as an alibi for actual inequality, I actually want to move today towards a more complex understanding of what Edward Said called universalizing, and to query what he meant by such a term. This argument might already seem abstract, as if I will be suggesting one theoretical model over another, but it will only work if it can become increasingly concrete. It could be that we answer the question that I posed at the outset of this talk, by simply claiming that Palestinian lives have value because they are Palestinian, and that there are specific values associated with Palestinian lives that have to be recognized in their specificity. To answer the question this way means bringing forth the specificity of Palestinian culture, daily life, artistic and cultural production, history and economics, religious and social organizations. And yet all that work is quite necessary, given the cultural effacement that Palestinians have suffered in the popular media, given the slander and the stereotypes. But can such an approach by itself answer the question of why certain lives can be publicly grieved and others are deemed ungrievable? Can it answer the question of why it is so difficult for there to be a powerful global consensus on the grievability of Palestinian lives? What do I mean by grievability, and what effect, if any, does conceiving of Palestinian lives as worthy of grief have on concrete social policy, much less on an effective resistance movement backed by international consensus? First of all, when we speak about a life as potentially grievable, We are talking about someone who is alive. Indeed, all of us here are potentially grievable, or at least I hope we are. When a life is from the start regarded as grievable, then every precaution will be taken to preserve that life and to safeguard that life against harm and destruction. If we think that all lives ought to be treated in that way, safeguarded from harm and destruction, then in my view, we embrace a principle of the radical equality of the grievable. Concretely, we can say that very often the statistics that show the overwhelming devastation of the population in Gaza compared with those within Israel are not enough to affect certain kinds of powerful rhetorics that foreground the right of Israel to self-defense. Whenever we talk about self-defense, we have to ask which self. Indeed, we have to ask who has a self that can be defended. Who is in the political position to have a self that can and ought to be defended? Is it possible within international political discourse to talk about Palestinian self-defense? Can those who live under settler rule defend themselves? Let us review once again the statistics we have about the differential losses that resulted from Operation Protective Edge. I do this not only to show the inequality of those losses, but rather to show how that inequality is covered over when certain losses count as real and others are waved away through certain discursive gestures that wield political power within a situation of structural inequality. Whether one takes the UN numbers or those offered by the Palestinian Center for Human Rights or the Al-Mizan Center for Human Rights, in July and August of this year, somewhere between 2,131 and 2,168 Palestinians were killed and 77 Israelis were killed. When we make a distinction between combatants and civilians, we are already on tricky political territory. For how is that distinction made, and who makes it? The UN claims that 1,473 of the Palestinian dead were civilians, but PCHR puts the number higher at 1,662 civilians, and this includes between 501 children and 257 women, or 519 children and 297 women, depending on your source. The Palestinian Ministry of Health reports 11,100 Palestinians were wounded, and that at least 100 of those will suffer long-term disability or illness. Especially hard hit, as you know, are the populations living within refugee camps. At least 80,000 refugee homes were damaged or destroyed during the bombardment of Gaza, and as many as 20,000 of those structures are no longer habitable. It is worth noting as well that the majority of Gaza's 110,000 homeless people are children. There are many more statistics that are important, including those who are traumatized, including those who suffered those losses and who survive to live in a world in which those losses are irreversible. And then those who require social and psychological support. How do those numbers get established? Can we ever know them? I give you these numbers, realizing that they are in the process of being revised, that new losses still are added to the list every week. I do this not because I think that numbers talk in ways that other arguments do not. In fact, I think that many people can glance at the numbers or hear the numbers and not be affected by what they see or hear, not be moved to conclude that what has happened is terrible or indeed unjustified, and they remain able to claim with apparent calm either that Palestinians brought this devastation on themselves or to regard the loss of life within Israel as of much greater concern. Indeed, the numbers do not speak for themselves. They require interpretation, even though we may think that the horror of it is and ought to be absolutely clear. We still have to make it clear. That means bringing forth the numbers, offering numbers and names, names and images, all that together with analysis and media presence. And the risk is, of course, that one will be entering into a certain media industry in which it is always the same picture of Palestinian devastation, and it continues and recurs as if it were some kind of inevitable reality, compounding the sense of political paralysis rather than moving its viewers to judge and to act. Of course, it is the human shield argument that functions to de-realize Palestinian losses. It was made popular in Operation Cast Lead and was renewed in July and August of this year with ferocious zeal. As Youssef and others have pointed out, the human shield argument is racist and reprehensible. It is important that this be said time and again, since it has not yet been heard where it should be. And saying it turns out not quite to be enough, since it is not only a pernicious argument, but a belief that is much more widely held than I would have thought. Indeed, when I first came across the argument that Palestinians put their children in the way of Israeli bombs, I thought it was so ridiculous that no one could possibly accept it. Of course, I was wrong, and I now see that I was much more wrong than I could have imagined. What gives such an argument its appeal and its credibility? The argument takes different forms, but the one that seems to circulate most often is that Hamas, in particular, places its rocket launchers in civilian areas, and so draws Israeli fires to those same areas, putting at risk the civilians living there. Such a claim should be easily brokered by determining where the rocket launchers actually are, but Israel does not, as far as I know, publish any of the maps or documentation it claims to have to support this view. Security. Moreover, the so-called handbook said to be discovered by Israelis in East Jerusalem that lays out the Hamas strategy to use and imperil its civilian population as human shields turned out to be a forgery. Some of those who defend Israel's bombing of civilian populations understand those civilians to be members of Hamas or to have voted for Hamas and conclude that by voting as they have put themselves in the way of Israeli bombs. They may not be combatants, but they also, according to this argument, if it is an argument, put themselves in harm's way by voting as they are said to have voted. The children who do not vote nevertheless belong to families who have ostensibly voted, and that means that they too will pay for their voting privileges with their lives. Indeed, I'm not sure whether from the point of view of aerial bombardment, anyone can know whether those who are targeted really voted for Hamas, did not vote or remain loyal to Fatah, but the argument makes clear that the status of civilian does not quite matter. For civilians are the ones who vote, and if they voted for Hamas, they are to pay with their lives. At this point, it's clear that civilian casualties are indeed quite deliberate, since Gaza was being punished for voting for Hamas, even though in many of the mainstream accounts, Hamas is said to have taken over Gaza in terms that liken that election to a coup. I myself am not in favor of Hamas, and I have never supported Hamas. I object to several dimensions of that political party: its charter, with its anti-Semitism, its beheadings, its rockets, its hierarchy, and its treatment of women, to name a few. I understand the arguments for armed resistance, but I am myself in favor of nonviolent forms of resistance. Indeed, one reason I have to say this out loud, even though it should be clear on the basis of my broader political views, is that any effort to study Hamas or understand its aims, or to see how it is figured within the Israeli political imaginary, is very often taken to be sympathy for Hamas, if not potential membership. So now that I have situated myself, I would, be the first lesbian Jewish post-structuralist. Okay, sorry. So now that I have situated myself, I want to make two remarks. One is that Hamas, the political party, is very often made to function as a synonym for Palestinians in Gaza. And from the Israeli state's perspective, the destruction of majority support for that party justifies the assault on civilians. In other words, it's precisely because civilians have largely supported Hamas that civilians are targeted. It does not seem to matter that there's a part of Hamas dedicated to armed resistance and a part of Hamas that takes care of social and medical services, irrigation, and education. Secondly, Hamas, because it is an Islamic party, is very often caricatured as a culture of martyrdom, which in clearly racist terms leads to the incredible generalization that Palestinians in general do not value life or the life of their children in the way that Israelis do, or in the way that people in the so-called West are said to do, So to the extent that the human shield argument relies on this gross stereotype that Palestinians, figured as the uncivilized and the pre-modern, do not value life as those of us in the West do, we see that a fundamentally Orientalist conceit is part of what makes this claim possible. The claim that Palestinians as a group sacrifice their children for the sake of their cause relies on a conception of Palestinians as barbaric, and this broader view of the Palestinians supports the more specific view that Hamas is responsible for its own civilian losses, especially the children. There's a great deal to be said about how women and children function in these kinds of arguments. Obviously, there's a special kind of shock and horror reserved for the destruction of the lives of women and children who are understood to be emblems of innocence. On the one hand, the accusation that Hamas has sacrificed them makes them barbaric. But this same assumption implies that if the IDF has deliberately targeted them for destruction, it is the IDF that is barbaric. So we see how the same premise operates in the accusation. Does it mean that at some level the IDF knows that it is engaged in a form of killing that is utterly unacceptable? I'm reticent to redeploy the language of barbarism, since it seems mainly to be opposed to civilization, and that term tends to work to distinguish among cultures that are more or less civilized, reproducing the scene of Orientalism. Indeed, it is one reason that I continue to have interest and faith in international protocols that simply call the destruction of civilian populations criminal. But I suspect that if the Israeli discourse that charges Palestinians with the barbaric sacrifice of its children believes that the deliberate destruction of populations of children is barbaric, that at some level it knows and believes that its own actions are barbaric. The point of the accusation against Hamas is then to cover over and to externalize what it considers to be its own barbarism. What is, of course, so very shocking about this set of arguments is that they clearly serve the purpose of deflecting from and rationalizing the fact that the Israeli Defense Forces have targeted civilians, massacred populations, and destroyed the infrastructural conditions of life in large parts of Gaza. The argument is meant to twist the terms of truth so that it is Palestinians who sacrifice their children and women, their civilians, not Israel, that has killed those vast numbers of people. Indeed, the evidence that Israel deliberately targeted civilians, that is, unarmed people, has been released by dissidents within the IDF, confirmed by UN workers in the area, and by Palestinian testimony. At some point, we have to ask whether there is a destructiveness at work that does not really care, finally, about the rationale for the destructiveness. The rationale seems to come later. It can suddenly shift, and it doesn't matter that the rationale remains consistent. After all, at first it seemed that the killing of Israelis in Hebron, itself quite hideous and horrible, was the reason for the attack on Gaza and the crackdown and increased detentions throughout the West Bank. But then it did not matter that the Hebron killers were not precisely Hamas. Those killings became the occasion to attack Gaza and to escalate into a full-scale war of bombardment. If, as Netanyahu claimed, the population of Gaza should now see what will happen to it if it continues its support for Hamas, then we might conclude that the point of the bombardment was to destroy that political party and its apparent hold on the majority of Gazans. But then it turned out that more sympathy for Hamas was generated among Palestinians in the West Bank than had ever been recorded before as a result of the bombardments. And so it seemed that Netanyahu's aim was foiled. But what if the aim was to claim that all of Palestine is or potentially is Hamas and to seek to establish the rocket-throwing, child-sacrificing figure of the Palestinian as the norm? If the point was to destroy the unity government, then at one point in this process that seemed to be failing. If the point was to establish the Palestinian Authority in Gaza as the dominant partner in any unity government, that also seems to be failing. If the point was to confirm Hamas as a terrorist organization, then that was surely called into question by the fact that Israeli representatives entered into negotiations with them in Cairo and so has begun to treat them, perhaps inadvertently, as diplomatic players. The fact seems to be that there was no one rationale for the bombardment, and that the rationale was constantly shifting. Are we perhaps asked by this circumstance to think of a destructiveness that is relatively indifferent to the question of whether that destructiveness is justified, that takes on justifications after the fact and switches them quickly without any care for consistency or accountability? Of course, the most explicit language of justification that the State of Israel has given mobilizes the language of self-defense, and that is the rationale that President Obama and others have used. Israel is entitled to self-defense. Given that Palestine is not yet formed and recognized as a state, although that seems to be happening in some interesting ways, and that Gaza remains under colonial rule in the sense that siege is an instrument of occupation, and Gaza in that sense remain occupied even precisely because it has no sovereign authority over its borders, then the appropriate framework for this conflict continues to be colonial rule. And the resistance to Israel is the resistance to colonial rule. Again, as I said earlier, I would like to see the charter of Hamas relinquished and repudiated, as long as the language concerning the destruction of Israel remains couched as it is in anti-Semitic rhetoric. Israel itself will be able to invoke self-defense for whatever destruction it causes. That said, the way that Israel invokes self-defense gives it permission for unbridled and unlimited assaults. For it is not only in relation to rockets sent into Israeli territory that Israel invokes self-defense. For some, Israeli self-defense requires the transfer of Palestinian Israelis outside of 48, and for more, self-defense implies that humiliation, harassment, detention, and imprisonment of massive numbers of Palestinians is justified, and self-defense also works to justify the massacre of civilian populations, forms of destruction that some recently have called genocidal. Indeed, if and when the very existence of another people on their land seems to be understood as a potential or actual threat to one's existence, then self-defense authorizes total war. In what I've laid out so far today, I think you can see that there are at least two forms of twisted logic. The first was that the massacre of children is made to appear as the deliberate choice and plan of the victim. The second is that the principle of self-defense, depending on how it is construed, can authorize limitless aggression. I began today with the discussion of grievable lives and asked whether we might be able to ask the question, what is the value of Palestinian lives? And I've suggested that the systematic devaluation of Palestinian lives proceeds through twisted arguments of the kind that I sought to expose. They themselves are the one who supposedly devalue their own lives and the lives of their children, or they, the Palestinians, are those who only seek to threaten Israeli lives and so ought to be understood as living threats, which means that taking their lives is the same as eliminating a threat to life, a threat to the life that matters, Israeli life. Life in that last claim is always Israeli life, the life that is considered to be more worthy of grief. How interesting, then, that the rabbi in New York, Sharon Kleinbaum, who sought to honor both Israeli and Palestinian losses by speaking the names of those who had been killed in the latest bombardment, was censored by her own community. How dare she stand for the principle that lives are and ought to be equally grievable? The criminal character of the attack on civilian populations ought properly to be considered and adjudicated by the International Criminal Court, and the arguments made for this by the National Lawyers Guild, the Center for Constitutional Rights, and numerous other legal associations cannot be heard unless and until the Palestinian Authority agrees to become a signatory to the ICC. There are those of you here today who know better than I do why that petition was initiated and then withdrawn. My own lay view on this matter is that as long as the ICC cannot adjudicate these matters, then the derealization of Palestinian losses continues. At stake in this matter is not only the documenting of deliberate targeting of civilian populations, their schools, mosques, and shelters, in effect the infrastructural conditions of life, but also the military and financial assisting of this operation by the U.S. government. The ICC, through the Rome Statute, offers the opportunity to establish a war crime, a crime against humanity, and/or genocide. The most cynical interpretation of the withdrawal of that petition by Abbas is that he seeks to keep favor with Israel and the United States by doing so, or that he seeks to gain permanent power over Hamas in whatever unity government survives. I do not know if that interpretation is correct, but I do think that for a global consensus on the value of Palestinian lives to emerge, the ICC is an important venue, one that ought not to be refused, especially for short-term strategic reasons. As you may know, I am a professor of the humanities and not a politician, not even a policy wonk. I read what I can, and I offer analyses that make use of whatever conceptual resources I have. I would like then, in the last section of this paper, to return to Edward Said, although it is strange to talk about returning to Said. Although he is gone, his thought remains with us as both inspiration and guide. I wonder if any of us have really caught up with him. I began today by asking whether we might be able to extend our ideas about political equality to the equality of the grievable, that is, the idea that all lives are equally grievable and equally valuable. I cautioned against a quick solution to this problem, one that would abstract people from their concrete realities, including the concrete inequalities with which they live. Although I do think that international criminal courts rely importantly on a notion of humanity when they articulate crimes against humanity, I think as well that forms of equality emerge when people are able to make historical connections between conditions of suffering and demands for redress, conditions of subjugation, and struggles for political self-determination. Said gives us some ways to think about making connections among different sorts of suffering, suggesting that we have to be capable of juxtaposing one historical form of suffering with another, not to assert their concrete identity with one another, but to see how different forms of subjugation can and ought to speak to one another. The demand to represent Palestinian suffering and aspiration is important to make it legible, to allow it to become grievable, the condition of outrage and redress, the demand for emancipation from colonial rule, the demand for political self-determination. But how do we understand this demand to represent collective suffering? Said's view was that Palestinian suffering had to be detailed in its specificity, but it also had to be framed in terms of its connection with other subjugated peoples. His concern was with those in exile, those hundreds of thousands who had been displaced from their lands in 48 or 67 or 83. So he wrote about those possibilities of connection among exiled peoples, and in that context he cited Hanan Ashrawi, who wrote some years ago that the Palestinian people are those whose national experience, and here I quote, belongs with that of the Armenians, the Jews, the Irish, the Cypriots, the American blacks, the Poles, the American Indians, at those terrifying frontiers where the existence and disappearance of peoples fade into each other, where resistance is a necessity, but where there is also sometimes a growing realization of the need for an unusual and to some degree an unprecedented knowledge. At best, this is Ashrawi still, at best I feel about these various Palestinian existences that they form a counterpoint of multiple, almost desperate dramas, each of us is aware of as occurring simultaneously with his or her own. So then Said, drawing inspiration from this remark, writes the following, and I quote, "To this terribly important task of representing the collective suffering of your own people, testifying to its travails, reasserting its enduring presence, reinforcing its memory, there must be added something else, which only an intellectual, I believe, has the obligation to fulfill. For the intellectual, the task, I believe, is explicitly to universalize the crisis, to give greater human scope to what a particular race or nation suffered, to associate that experience with the suffering of others." As much as the idea of belonging to a common humanity seems crucial to the perspective of the International Criminal Court, there's another form of belonging that is also universal, or rather universalizing in Said's view. When and how does this universalization happen? Well, for Said, it happens precisely, and I quote again, in the practice of associating, not identifying, one's own experience of suffering to that of others." End quote. He continues, "It is inadequate only to affirm that a people was dispossessed, oppressed, or slaughtered, denied its rights and its political existence, without at the same time doing what Fanon did during the Algerian War, affiliating those horrors with the similar afflictions of other people. This does not mean a loss in historical specificity," he writes, "but rather it guards against the possibility that a lesson learned about oppression in one place will be forgotten or violated in another place or time." It follows then that to represent the sufferings of one's own people does not relieve a person of the duty, and I quote again, "of revealing that your own people now may be visiting related crimes on their victims," end quote. Indeed, this was the view of the writer Primo Levi, the survivor of Auschwitz, who objected to the bombings of Lebanon in 1982 and objected to Israeli complicity in the slaughters in Sabra and Shatila. He insisted that one form of suffering cannot be used as the pretext for causing another form of illegitimate suffering, and that if one were to learn from one's own suffering, it would mean generalizing the unacceptable character of that suffering so that, indeed, no one should suffer in that way or in an equally illegitimate way. That is not to say that all sufferings are the same, they are not, but that they can become the basis for widening circles of solidarity, especially when we are willing to undertake a comparative analysis, make the links, and engage in a practice of cultural and political translation. Said knew exceedingly well that these are distinctly different histories of displacement, the displacement of Palestinians and the displacement of Jews in the 20th century, and that there's no absolute structural analogy to be drawn between them. After all, it is most often the case the displacement of the Jews, which led to the establishment of Israel, was the cause of the dispossession of the Palestinians, a situation quite brilliantly relayed in Kanafani's Return to Haifa. The claims of one group dispossessed cannot justify dispossessing another group. After all, the establishment of Israel as a sanctuary for European Jewish refugees produced a new refugee problem for the Palestinians, which means that a refugee problem continues to be reproduced in the 20th century up until the present. A comparative approach to the refugee problem, let's remember Said was a professor of comparative literature, a field that fosters the recognition of uneasy or unexpected parallels between different texts and contexts, or which regularly undergoes shifts in frame. Okay, so a comparative approach to the refugee problem becomes possible only when the vision is widened to include several instances of the refugee problem. And in drawing the analogy between Jews and Palestinians, which is distinct, I think, from an analogy between Israelis and Palestinians, Said is seeking to widen the lens on the refugee problem, mobilizing the potential for a diasporic understanding between those in the diaspora or whose diasporic past continues to inform their ethical and political sensibility. Diaspora, or sometimes exile, is not foregrounded as the aim or goal of politics, nor can it possibly describe a fixed location. It is rather proposed as a critical perspective on forms of political nationalism that have required the repeated expulsion of those perceived as non-national. In the case of Zionism, those who favor expulsion are understood as self-segregating, continuing a form of settler colonialism that is bound up with the historical and ongoing dispossession of Palestinians from their homes and the building of dwelling structures on those appropriated lands, the settlements, and the destruction of homes, the expanding and debilitating practice of indefinite detention. So as I said, it was no accident that Said was a literary scholar, since, and a scholar of comparative literature in particular, he really thought that the work of bringing disparate cultural traditions into contact with one another could produce a more expansive solidarity, as long as the translation of one cultural situation into another was not an act of assimilation or domination. His perspective was the one of someone who had lost his home. He used the term exile. But we also now have to understand what it is to be an exile in one's own home, or on the land where one's home used to be, or on the land across the wall from where one's home used to be or on the grounds of a devastated structure that used to be called one's home, but where no one can live. Said wrote that the exile is one who sees things as they were and as they are, and as they were there, as they are here, and so sees double and cannot do otherwise. And yet there are possibilities of seeing that emerge from the exilic condition that are to be valued. And I quote, "An idea or experience is always counterposed with another, making them both appear in an unpredictable light." He then suggests that this practice of juxtaposition and contrapuntal reading brings us back to his ideas about universality or universalizing, about what he calls human rights and matters of justice. He writes, "From that idea of juxtaposition, one gets a better, perhaps even more universal idea of how to think, say, about a human rights issue in one situation by comparison with another." End quote. Of course, we do need abstract principles to make the point that all lives are valuable, that they ought to be treated as potentially grievable in the same way, and that losses have to be marked, acknowledged, and mourned. We need that universalizing moment when we say all lives. But to make the point politically, we have to be able to communicate that Palestinian lives are lives and ought to be treated as such. It is, of course, both astonishing and appalling that this case has to be made at all, but I think we've seen how effectively certain losses can be derealized, or how quickly populations are defined as targets, as shields, as attackers, renamed and reimagined within a scenario of war. When a child is figured as a shield, he or she is turned into metal, into an instrument to shield rockets or instruments of war. That means that child, even the one playing on the street or hanging out in the playground, the one who moves too close to the sea on a hot summer day, that child is somehow, somewhere, hiding and shielding a bomb, a rocket launcher. So if you see the photo of the child by the sea, what you should see is that there's a bomb right behind that child, and that child is a function of the bomb. Okay. At this point, the human body is transfigured by those who are targeting that body into an instrument of war, and the destruction of that child is understood as the destruction of a war instrument. How do we stop or reverse this most nefarious of transfigurations? The simple photograph will help, but it does not suffice. The publishing of the statistics will help, but it doesn't do the job all on its own. I do not know the practical way, though I think that nothing will happen without building a global consensus. So, why is it so difficult for there to be a powerful global consensus on the grievability of Palestinian lives? I think it can be built through forms of solidarity with other struggles against colonialism, not only to show that the situation in Palestine continues to be that of colonial domination, and to show as well that Orientalist and racist figures of the Palestinian continue to function as popular justification for the elimination of their lives. We can and must say that Palestinian lives are also lives, but to do that we have to fight a colonial and racist legacy with all the resources from other anti-colonial struggles, and we have to do this as well by pursuing those juxtapositions between forms of suffering that are not always set against one another or lined up next to each other. I think Said tried to do this by claiming that Jews and Palestinians both suffered forms of dispossession, and that this might become the basis for a common commitment not only to the rights of all refugees, but for the right not to become a refugee in one's own land. Perhaps that moment of hopefulness seems very unlikely at this moment. I can understand that. But there is some hope. There's Jewish Voice for Peace. There's Nonviolent Palestinian Resistance Movement in BDS. There are legal associations and institutes such as this one. There are grassroots struggles on the ground for prisoners' rights, for stopping the wall, for saving the trees and the land. And there is, despite the failure of many international institutions to condemn Israeli aggression, a growing sense that a terrible massacre has happened and that many ruses have gotten in the way of grieving those losses and demanding redress. We could say that all those lives killed suffered human rights violations, But the framework of human rights cannot quite grasp the systematic character of this destruction, a destruction that has been going on periodically, repeatedly for some time, and which has to be understood as the violent character of militarization and colonial rule. I do think that there are shifts happening in the broader global understanding of what has happened, but they remain muted in some ways that have to be countered. One reason I'm in favor of pursuing justice through the ICC is that I think there is a chance to make the analogies between what is happening in Palestine and what has happened in other places where populations have suffered expulsion, destruction, and statelessness. Following Said's view, it is only consistent for a people to affirm their own rights to be relieved of statelessness, their rights to sanctuary under conditions of persecution, and to make that case by establishing the general and transposable character of those rights. Even if the historical conditions of displacement differ, if one people or its emerging and continuing state apparatus is responsible for the displacement of another, reparation begins precisely through a recognition of the general and transposable character of the rights of the stateless to the political conditions of belonging and to the rights of political self-determination. Making that claim in the global arena allows for that process to begin, the transposability of rights accorded one population to another in the name of equality, and with the hope that translations and juxtapositions such as these lead to an institutional recognition of the equal value of lives now extended to Palestinian lives. The task is to forge a world in which no one asks ever again, what is the value of Palestinian lives? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Butler. Thank you very much. We're going to move to a Q&A, and just want to remind those watching online, you can send your questions in by tagging hashtag ESML14. So we'll begin with questions in the room, and please do wait for a microphone to get to you so that we can hear you up here and the audience can hear you as well. We'll start in the front row here. Just one moment.
Thank you. It's a profound lecture. We appreciate it. My name is Said Erikat. I'm a Palestinian journalist. My question to you, you're saying that this reduction of the value of Palestinian life, as far as Israel is concerned, is not distinctly Israeli, but inherent in the aspect of colonialism that Israel is, that it is really, and we can look, this being the Indigenous Day, I mean, we can look at examples in history. The British shot 5,000 rounds, inflicting almost 5,000 casualties. So, having said this, do you see a point where the Israelis can accept the equality of grief for Palestinians so long as they continue to exist, basically, through a colonial project? Thank you.
The quick answer is no. I think the colonial project has to be overcome altogether for the grievability of Palestinian lives to be established, because the slanderous stereotype, as it were, is mobilized precisely in order to maintain the occupation, to extend indefinite detention indefinitely, and to take civilian lives when it proves strategic to do so. So I do think, but there's a question: what comes first, right? What comes first? And my sense is that it would be interesting to see what would happen if, and I know many people are involved in this struggle, trying to ally the Palestinian struggle with the struggles of the indigenous, ally the Palestinian struggle with the struggles of the Irish Republican Army, ally the Palestinian struggles with the historical struggles of Algeria, not necessarily ending up with the same outcomes of any of those struggles, but to suggest that kind of alliance gives it a kind of broader framework, and it reconceptualizes the the political terrain, so that we're not just concerned with this incident or this violation of human rights or that one. We have a framework. It's specific to Palestine, but it has these really, really important comparative dimensions to other anti-colonial struggles. And I do think that as people throw colonized power off, right, and this is a Fanonian point, I suppose, that greater humanness comes into focus. Greater humanness gets produced and asserted and known, and that it may be in the very struggle of throwing it off, in the very struggle of overcoming it, with international solidarity, that is a kind of coming into recognizability as a life worth valuing and a life worth honoring.
We'll go to the lady in the third row here, ma'am. Go ahead, behind you.
Considering how important you thought ICC is, I am wondering if it's only Mahmoud Abbas who could apply to it, if there is any other group that could possibly apply for this.
I don't know the specifics on that. If somebody else does, it would be great to hear. But my understanding is that he is the designated authority who has the power to apply, and that he has been asked to apply, and then he decided not to apply. And even when people speculated that perhaps Hamas put pressure on him not to apply because they don't want to be targeted, my understanding is that they did say, no, do it. We'll take that. We'll take the scrutiny. They can inquire into what we do as well, and we will stand by their judgment. So it's enigmatic why he took that back. But my understanding is that he's the only one who has the kind of legal designation to do it at this point. I don't know.
Okay, we'll go right over here. Try to get around the room, and we'll come back.
Thank you for your lecture. You mentioned at some point that the presentation of the Palestinian struggle by virtue, which they bring onto themselves, continues to be seen as an inevitable reality that fosters political paralysis. And when I've noticed people creating juxtapositions between the Palestinian struggle and other indigenous peoples, or other displaced peoples historically, it seems to have a risk of creating a greater sense of inevitability of the struggle because they are, under colonial rule, as so many other people, they're going to suffer in the same way. How can we overcome that?
Well, I think as much as we need to give representation to collective suffering and do that within a comparative frame, as Said suggests we do, we also need to have a comparative analysis of resistance movements and solidarity movements and movements for liberation or movements for political self-determination, some of which have worked. I mean, there has been massive decolonization. We can look at those histories as well and use them for semi-utopian purposes.
Gentleman right here has been waiting patiently.
Yes.
Yes, thanks. Thanks very much. I'm Norman Birnbaum.
Nice to meet you.
Yes, same here. At the 1944 trial of the Prussian plotters against Hitler, one of them was asked why he had revolted or why he had participated in the plot. And he said, because of the many murders. And at that point, the presiding judge, the brutal Nazi judge, Freisler, lost his countenance, his cool, and began to yell, what do you mean by using the term murders for the policies of the Third Reich? Thinking of this, one wonders about the normalization, so to speak, of Israel behavior, in the sense that the behavior of the Israel state, of its executives, armies, and so on, and of its supporters in the diaspora and other supporters who are by no means Jewish, represents a certain triumph of Zionism, namely Israel has become a normal, modern, brutal state using all the means at its disposal to protect itself against threats, real, imagined, constructed, or invented. There are plenty of other instances of this, not least in our own brief national history. But it seems to me that your admirable request based on, or demand, or suggestion based on Edward's work, that we admit the suffering peoples to a kind of equality, to an equality such that they can grieve, ignores the fact to some degree that modern normalcy, at least for much of the 20th century and our century, consists precisely of the kinds of brutalities the Israel army exercised in Gaza, which were perfectly normal, recognized as such, and indeed had a good deal of support in American opinion.
Mm-hmm. Well, I appreciate your comment, although it's a very despondent comment. I understand. It makes me have to counter with more cheerfulness than I actually have. But I'm going to try to do my bit here. And I guess what I want to say is that, of course, you're right that massacres such as those we recently witnessed have become normalized over time, and even a sign of military strength, and even a sign of membership in certain militarized, in the community of militarized nation states that do this periodically or indeed sometimes systematically. At the same time, it seems to me that there's a counter-normalization movement going on that seeks to expose the normalization, say, of civilian targeting, and to try to resist that. Now, that's something that I think Youssef and I were talking about earlier today, that it used to be that there was greater moral outrage when we recognized how many civilian losses there were in military exercises such as these, or when we realized that there were actually orders given, yeah, go ahead, you've had a hard day, take your shot at a civilian population, it's fine. Or we will look the other way, you bomb where you need. And it's those reports that we're starting to see more of. So you know, in a way, I am asking the same question you are. Where is the outrage? How can that outrage be marshaled? How can it be? How can it produce a counter-normalization effort? And one reason, I mean, I know that the international criminal courts have limited power, and they don't have their own army, and they're not binding, and there's all kinds of problems. But they do have a power to name, right? This is criminal, right? Let's remember, this is criminal, right? And I think, you know, as much as there is that ethos of unbridled militarism that seeks to pump up its own status and standing in the world through its unbridled destructiveness, there's also some fear of being that far away from international consensus. And we can actually see it. We see a rift in Europe itself, for instance, and we see a rift in the United States between those who understand, oh yeah, well, that's what they have to do, and those who really don't understand and are not willing to allow this to become normalized. And, you know, that's what we used to call a hegemonic struggle. So maybe we need to keep alive the idea that we're still in a hegemonic struggle, and we have to be part of counter-normalization in the way that you've described. Yeah.
Thank you for a wonderful and stimulating talk. Carolyn Fleur-Loeb, and I'm a Middle Eastern anthropologist. Mm-hmm. I want to really take my question from this morning's headlines, mm-hmm. and that is that a number of the international NGOs, donor groups, yes. have refused to engage in assisting the rebuilding of Gaza on the basis that it has already been destroyed 3 times, and why should we do it again, because it's only going to happen again. Mm-hmm. So in light of what you have been speaking about, enlightened by your own remarks and those of our beloved Edward Said, you know, what can you add to this level of argument that victimization is normalized and that there's nothing we can do about it, and so we just accept that Gaza cannot be rebuilt? this morning's headlines.
Yes, well, I did. I'm not sometimes the Washington papers don't say the same thing as the New York Times, and it's very interesting to me. I see, because I read the New York Times article, and it seems to me that this is a brokering situation where the NGOs say no, and then Israel comes forward with either more money or more temporary promises. And what I think we need to think about is the way in which rebuilding becomes an opportunity to renegotiate power relations. If the State of Israel and the U.S. and others are able to bring NGOs in, there's a chance that we could see the NGOization of Gaza, which would then allow for a parallel structure there with the West Bank. And as much as those NGOs are terribly important for repairing infrastructure, they cannot stop the process of destruction, right? In fact, if anything, they're waiting in the wings to repair whenever destruction happens. And I see that some of them don't want to be complicitous with the process in that way, right? You're depending on us to rebuild. It's always your prerogative to destroy. But I do think we ought to be paying attention to how that issue gets resolved, because people will be brokering for power positions in the process of rebuilding, and it's a new way to establish dominance, and perhaps through the NGOization of the area to undermine popular struggles for political self-determination.
The corner over here, and we'll come back.
Thank you very much for being here. I wanted to explore a little bit your discussion of working in solidarity with Palestinians and, in fact, other oppressed peoples. From where you stand, as a half-Jewish woman with a Palestinian-American daughter who lived in Palestine for several years, but now living here in the United States, how does one do that with integrity? Because, as someone who's an activist, as a writer, I'm also aware of this concept and have, in fact, been told, well, you must work in your community. What does that mean to you? How do you, as a woman of integrity, work in solidarity with people that who you're not one of? In other words, you're not a Palestinian, but yet you want to work in solidarity with them. How does one do that, in your view?
Well, I think a lot of it depends on how you understand your community. And it sounds like your community is already a double community and an overlapping community. But if we think more broadly, I'm a U.S. citizen, and I am at least partially responsible for speaking out about my own government's investments and its support of that area. So any U.S. person could and should have a view on this matter. And I'm an American Jew. I don't have relatives in Israel, although I'd come from a very strong Zionist background. And I've had to struggle with that and with my community of origin. But I have found some Jewish groups that allow me to keep that more local sense of belonging, but also to be part of solidarity networks. But if I ask the question, who am I when I'm in a solidarity network, it's not just that I'm an American or that I'm a Jew or I'm this or that. I mean, I could name other things that I am that would be not very interesting. But I also belong to a global community. I mean, no. And so, I think the real question I have is, where do people draw the line when they decide which community they belong to? And it's why the so-called strictly communitarian position never made sense to me. It's like, think about European refugees, think about Palestinian refugees who are like living all over the place and are multilingual or are truly many cultures, are truly from many places, are truly exilic in Said's sense, and yet also belonging, but having to decide what are the terms of belonging. And do I only care about those, or do I care primarily about those who are closest to me and defined in the same demographic way as me? What would that mean? Isn't that part of what's wrong with the world? That we imagine that we can only identify with and represent those who are like us. I mean, I find that worrisome. I find that to be a refusal of difference and a refusal of the political and cultural and demographic complexity of the world we're living in. And because obviously we are also interconnected through economy and through militarization and through political and social institutions of various kinds, it seems to me that something called global responsibility is crucial. We may start from a specific place and we may have a particular path into that, and our way of doing it may be inflected by all of that, but that doesn't mean we don't belong to those wider circles or shouldn't.
Oh, in the back here, gentleman. His hand up.
Thank you. Can we make a comparison between the Palestinian situation and the situation of the Kurds? It's also been going on for a long time, and of course, we hear a lot less about that when they get hit by Turkey or whatever.
Well, they're kind of being hit by ISIS right now, I think. But I think there are many issues to be said about that, and I'm not sure that I can elaborate. But Hanan Ashrawi was speaking some time ago, and she said perhaps it's the Armenians would be one site of association or affiliation, and I think the Kurds, given their expulsion from so many national borders and their inability to establish their own national borders or to be accepted as full and equal citizens, say in Turkey, has made them into a really important refugee issue. And sometimes, when refugee issues have been going on for decades and decades, they also become, to a certain degree, naturalized. Right? We forget to see this is inequality, this is expulsion, this is the effect of non-inclusion in those ways. I think there's much more to be said about that, and I think much more also to be said about the vast numbers of refugees that are being produced every day in Syria and outside of Syria. It's really stunning. We're going to have to be thinking about all that, and in relationship to the politics of Israel-Palestine as well.
Okay, we'll have one final question here. You may just bring the microphone over as we are over on time.
No, thank you very much for a lecture that I think has gone beyond the issue by issue, event by event approach to often dealing with the complexity of the Palestine-Israel situation. I come from South Africa, I think, which has given a great prefix to what the Palestinians suffer, the apartheid wall, the apartheid Zionists, etc., etc. And I often fear that it masks more than it reveals, because it may lead to a sense that if only there were Mandela, the problem would be solved. If only, and Israel says, but we are not racist because we have not put these things on the law books. They've effectively externalized. So I think that there's an intellectual laziness sometimes, although there's a shorthand that is useful from time to time. I don't know, I thought that out of what you've said, there seems to be a very vicious triangle that may need unraveling, and it will be interesting to hear what you say. I think on the one hand, how do we increase the grievability of Palestinian lives and not those of us who support the Palestinians be factionalized in the process, that we get divided between the left and the right within Palestine, Hamas and Fatah, etc., etc., and so we may contribute at the apex of that triangle, we may contribute to reducing grievability, because if it is not, if it's Hamas, then I'm less worried about it. I think the second point of the triangle that may need unraveling is, how does one deal, despite the fact that they insist on fusing the two personas between Jew and Zionist, how do we continue to insist on delinking it in order to salvage the human from the general self-dehumanization that is going on. And so, and what do we appeal to in order to grow those kind of grassroots movements that you speak about? So I think that it is to increase the leverage of the human over the dehumanized within Palestine. And then the third one is, how do we, from particularly the West, resist this automatic victimhood that is transferred in time from World War II and before to today, that continues to be a fig leaf for allowing barbarity? And how do we ensure that the battle around victimhood is redefined? I just thought that for me, out of your lecture, seems to be a very vicious triangle that needs diffusing. And I don't know if you have any ideas on that.
Well, I'm going to be brief because I know we've gone over. But let me just say this, that I think the effort to establish solidarity with the South African example, if I may, has more to do with the definition of apartheid. And I think that there are two very interesting and complex views on that, at least. But one of them is, whatever is happening in Palestine is not quite the same as what happened historically in South Africa. So the analogy doesn't quite work. Or to look at how genocide has actually been, or not genocide, I'm sorry, how apartheid has been defined legally, and see that the legal definition of apartheid applies to very different historical formations of apartheid. At which point we could say that there's apartheid in Palestine and was apartheid in South Africa, without saying that South Africa and Palestine are the exact same. And that's what Said had in mind. He wanted this cultural specificity to be preserved, but he wanted the resonance, and he wanted the possibility for a comparison to take place without everybody ending up being in the exact same situation. I really think that's what he called for. And that would also be true for ideals of political self-determination. I mean, we may agree that what happened in South Africa with the end of apartheid was a partial liberation, right? There were some pretty rotten deals made, right? So we didn't see economic equality achieved. We didn't see the end of racism as a social and economic reality. So there's that. I do think that there are two issues on the question of the Jew and Israel, and one of them, of course, is that the state of Israel wants to claim it represents the Jewish people, and anybody who seeks to criticize the state of Israel is at risk of being told that they are involved in an anti-Semitic enterprise, and that's a real trap if you're colonized and you're trying to object to colonial rule, and you're called an anti-Semite when you're trying to object to colonial rule. So I think I think on the one hand that claim needs to be stronger. It's like, we're not objecting to Jews, we're not objecting even to the future possibility of some kind of Israel. What we are objecting to is the continuation of colonial rule. What we're objecting to is militarization, and to be very, very specific about it. I do think that Hamas should get rid of its charter language. I don't buy the argument that, it doesn't really matter, it's just on the books, they don't use it. I don't care. I think Hamas should get rid of its anti-Semitic rhetoric, and it should get rid of it. It would be a huge symbolic importance. It would allow people to adjust and possibly hear what's going on in a different way. And I think it's wrong, and I think it should be taken away. I also think, there are major efforts on the part of various Jewish communities throughout the world to establish independent Jewish organizations that are critical of Israel and that allow for solidarity. They can be left Zionist, they can be anti-Zionist, they can be pro-boycott or anti-boycott, but they are to the left significantly of how Israel is defining that. And I also think there's room to think about Jewish values and how Jewish values have to be reclaimed from the Israeli state. I think there are many ethical resources we can find in the Jewish tradition for the critique of militarism, for the argument for equality, for the value of cohabitation. And the preciousness of life, right? We're all taught that. You know, our mourning practices, even the most evanescent life is worthy of grief. And let me just say this about victimization. It is true that Said wanted us to find ways of representing collective suffering. And he wanted us to do it in comparison with a number of different groups so that we could see what the alliances are, but also so that we could see what the possibilities of moving out of it are. But unless grief is acknowledged, unless loss is acknowledged, it seems to me it's very hard to move forward. Because if we take the victimization to be permanent, or if we take the losses or if we're numb to the losses, it's, oh, more losses, right? We don't have that affective basis to say this is an outrage, this ought not to happen, and I will struggle to make sure it does not happen. We don't have it collectively. So it seems to me that mourning doesn't stop with mourning. Mourning is part of outrage and the articulation of ideals that we want to see embodied in the world. And it has to take that, it has to convert into action, and it can. But for those who are derealized, whose losses are no losses, who don't exist or are not recognized, or whose agency is constantly being disfigured or transfigured in pernicious ways, it's very hard to get to break out of that slander, to break out of that stereotype, to show what legitimate resistance is and why it is legitimate. And that's perhaps where a line with historically and in a contemporary way with other anti-colonial struggles may well be a great support. I thank you for your...
Thank you, Professor Butler. Thank you very much. Thank you all.